All right, Stephanie, as I said, has been a previous presenter for us, and she has done some amazing work with the various apps that teachers can use in the classroom. And she is a certified Google trainer and technology innovation specialist. She teaches at Richwood High School in New Jersey, and this is her 4th year using the Cambridge Latin course and her 17th year of teaching. And she is a very, very enthusiastic Cambridge user, and we're really excited to hear her tell us about rubrics and how teachers can develop them to assess students fairly, easily, and comprehensively. So, Stephanie,
Thank you so much for such a glowing introduction, Martha. I'm happy to be with you all tonight. So when we think about rubrics, there are so many words that I think come into our mind. There are so many, educational buzzwords that are circling around us. We do use rubrics, I think, for a lot of different purposes. You could use it for testing or projects or, any sort of assessment purpose. But there are a lot of different things to envision when it comes to rubrics. And so that's, I wanted to address the nature of rubrics tonight in a couple different ways. So I prepared a quick outline of the objectives that I was hoping to get to tonight. As Martha and Ginny can attest to, I'm a bit of a talker, so if I'm talking too much or if I'm explaining something too fast, please feel free to stop me and to say, wait a second, hold on, I missed that step, or maybe you want to ask me a question about a document that I'm showing to you, and then we can kind of go from there. So first I want to look at different rubric types, and we'll look at some, how-tos, how-not-tos as well. I do want to talk about best practices in terms of rubric development. I do not believe in any way, shape, or form that I have the market cornered on best practices for rubric development. I'd love to hear from some of you in terms of the rubrics that you've developed or some points that you've noted along your own journeys as teachers. I do want to have a discussion about criteria that you establish on the rubrics, as well as the categories for the grading, how we weight scores together. And I want to introduce a notion of performance checklists as an interesting diversion to rubrics that still has the rubric connotation, but just executed in a different way. So after we complete our discussion about rubrics and what they look like and what they can be, I want to talk about setting them up and how to use them in your classroom using some technology tools. So we'll be using some Google Classroom features, as well as some templates that have been created by a really phenomenal Google source named Alice Keeler. So without further ado, let's start our discussion. I want to start out by talking about what a rubric is not, because I think that sometimes it's easier to see examples of best practices when you can see examples of practice that are probably not the best. So these are actually pieces of rubrics that are both mine and not mine. So I just wanted to use them as a source of discussion and constructive criticism. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about that I've highlighted on this slide is the way in which the categories rather are laid out for how the points are assigned. And right now you can see that in the first example they are poor, fair, good, excellent, or superior. And then in the other one it's excellent, good, fair, and poor. And I think that one of the things I want to bring up in the rubric discussion that I think is a really pertinent point is that terms like that are very subjective, and they're very, in a weird way, they're very judgmental. And I think that assigning a student's performance in a word or an adjective like poor or superior, I think that a student will internalize that a lot more than the number that goes in the category below. And so I want to talk tonight about, other ways of expressing the same idea that their performance might be superior in such a way, but in a way to try to help or to avoid the idea of like name calling. And I know that nobody, when they create a rubric, is actually calling the student by that name. And I don't think that anybody out there is doing that. But I'm just hoping that we can have a more constructive discussion to talk about the performance in a different set of terms to help the students to sort of detach themselves from the scores that they're getting on the rubric. The second area that I want to talk about, which is highlighted with this number 2 over here, one of the criteria that's given on this particular rubric is interesting introduction. Again, I feel like that's kind of a subjective sort of terminology. What's interesting to me might be very different from what's interesting to a student who's listening to a presentation or the student who's giving a presentation. So as we're looking at developing rubrics, I want you to think about taking away some of that subjective language and making it more objective. You know, one of the purposes of having rubrics is to have an objective grading tool so that students don't feel like you're looking at their project and you're giving it a 90 because you don't like them enough to give them a 100 or anything like that. You know, we are trying to make sure that a rubric is an assessment tool rather than a statement of judgment about the student. So with number 3, I wanted to talk about, and I think we all do this to a certain extent in our rubrics. These are sort of objective criteria. These are like almost checking a box things. You know, did the student have a conclusion? Does the student have a bibliography? Does the presentation have required information? This is all well and good, but I'm just cautioning you about having checklist sort of items when the grading mechanism for those checklist items is superior. You know, it's like, what is a superior bibliography? You know, does the student have one or not have one? Like, what are you really assessing here? Are you assessing whether or not they have it in the right style of, you know, MLA or APA, or are you just checking the box that the student has one? And if that's just checking a box, then maybe it doesn't belong on a rubric, and maybe we need to think about separating the content of the project, or you know, the objective things that they have to do versus the performance, which is really where you want to use more of a rubric format for. And number 4 here is the idea of too many criteria that exist in one different criterion category. So like in this one, it's commentary, discussion, and analysis of poem. Like, you know, to have that many objectives in one field makes it a little bit hard even for us to assess. I mean, you know, what if the students' commentary is not great, but their discussion is okay and their analysis is good? You know, how do we really capture that in one field? So, you know, just something to think about as you're developing your rubrics, you know, the number of criteria that you have and how many rows essentially that you have to express that. Further examples that I think, you know, breed similar conversation. Number 1, the title of this, I mean, this is called a rubric. I won't tell you if it's mine or not, but but it's called A Helpful Guide for Grading Theater Plays. Is this really a rubric or is it a guide? And I think that you need to kind of help your students to differentiate rubric, which would be the grading mechanism, from a guide for what makes the project. So, you know, assessing it versus presenting it. I think those are 2 different things. And I think that we owe our students the opportunity to be more discreet about what we're assessing them on. The other thing that I wanted to note here with number 2 is, again, this is just another example of using some pretty subjective grading terms. So like, you know, 6 is a wow, which is great. But then, you know, number 1 is expressed as what? And I think that that is, again, not the best way to express to our students that it was hard to understand or it was not very, you know, it wasn't a very good quality. So just to kind of concentrate on some of the words that we're using. In a similar way, number 3, the thing I want to talk about here, this seems like more of a list. And I know that, you know, rubrics, they probably get a bad rap because they are very chart or, you know, what's what I'm looking for, spreadsheet oriented. And maybe not all students are quite as, you know, organized or think in terms of columns and rows and things like that. But I do think that having it expressed in more of a chart pattern helps students to kind of balance, where their performance is versus where their score is. And I don't know if this list of sentences is really doing it the same kind of justice. That's something that's more objective does. The fourth thing that I wanted to focus on here is the difference between establishing a criterion and providing what is exceptional. And this is something that I'm going to talk about when I get to the idea of a performance checklist in a little bit. So right now, the student should have focus, and this is what it means to have focus, which is great, but then you don't necessarily need another explanation for what exceptional focus looks like if it should just meet the definition. Like this should essentially just be the same, but then, you don't need two columns for it, you really just need the one. And then finally, and this may or may not be my rubric, but there's the notion of text of the description of the grade versus the grade itself. And I think that we should either have all numbers going across or all text and numbers going across. And this combination of text and numbers, but then going to just numbers here, I don't know if that's really developing the student's awareness of where he or she falls on that spectrum. And I say this with a grain of salt because, I've made a lot of rubrics that have text that goes all the way across and, kind of descends in each category just slightly. And it is very, very hard to word each one of these boxes to use the nuance of language to really get at some of the differences, especially when it comes to a row like creativity. I've really struggled in my time of developing exact verbiage that means that one is more creative than another one. And so, maybe we could try to move away from that in general so I'll show you some rubrics that I think hopefully improve upon that. So these are some examples of rubrics that I've used and I've developed for my classes over more recent years as I've kind of gotten hip to what I think that rubrics should and could be. So I'm going to, and you can do this too, you should be able to, if you're following along with the presentation, you should be able to click on each of these rubrics and it should open in a new window. If for some reason I have not made the permissions as public as I should, please just let me know because I'm happy to make that adjustment on my end. So I want to start with these two on the left, which are project specific, but I do think that they offer some good rubric-based discussion. So this is a rubric that I've used with a recitation project in my Latin 4 class. In my Latin 4 class, they actually have to recite the first 11 lines of the Aeneid. And I'm a little bit old school about that. I know that it's not the most modern thing to have students memorize a poem, but I do. And if you want students, and this could be something that's memorized, or this could be something that you're asking students to read a passage in front of you for performance's sake. So what I've done here that capitalizes on some of the discussion that I've launched earlier is I've just given here the ideal version of the criterion. So the criterion of delivery is that the presentation of the poem reflects an internalization of the content, authoritative, confident recitation, clear performance, no pauses, no stops. Now, each of these, criterion, I know that I was saying earlier that, we should avoid having multiple criterion in each in each row. I hope that this is an example of trying to pare it down and use something that's just more focused in each particular row. And then moving over here to the grading part of it, two things I want to note here. One is that in the last few years, I've started using, instead of, excellent, superior, fair, good, more subjective terms, I've started using the idea of proficiency. And so my categories generally have to do with proficiency. So there's proficient. So this is, the kid who can show me proficiency on it. And then there's approaching proficiency. And then, the lowest level would be lacking proficiency. And I think that takes some of the subjective nature out of the terminology. of the way that the students are viewing their own performance in the way of being proficient versus whether it's a good or bad performance. So within that, I've also tried to establish here, there's this fourth column that has, that provides for kids who go above and beyond. So an exemplar performance, and it just gets 1 extra point, but that's 1 extra point for that row. And you can kind of, tailor the grades for however you want in terms of how much the assignment is worth. This also gives individual criteria the opportunity to have an exemplar performance there that may compensate for a less than exemplar performance elsewhere. And so I have had students who, give me a very confident and authoritative delivery of the poem, but their pronunciation is off. So, maybe they can get an exemplar score here, and then that compensates for the fact that down here they might get a 3 on the rubric in that sense. So, this is perhaps one example. I don't want to spend too much time in each of these rubrics, especially because I know that you have access to it and I don't want to read everything to you. Another project-specific rubric is this final project rubric that I wrote for a project of exploring Rome. This is an example of what I was getting at before, where it is sometimes almost like pulling teeth to write 4 different descriptions of the same type of performance, just changing the nuance of each field to accommodate for, the various levels of scores. It can be done though, and I don't want you to think from my prior discussion that this is not, a best practice in any way. It is just exceptionally hard to do it. And so this is a rubric that accounts for 4 different categories. So there's proficiency, approaching proficiency, below proficiency, and then lacking proficiency. And then for each of the fields, I kind of played around with the numbers a little bit too. One thing to kind of be aware of, and this is not something that I've ever thought of. Actually, one of my students brought this to my attention. So one of my students imagined that he or she, I don't remember the gender of the student, but the student said, what if I get approaching proficiency with every single field here? And they did the math, and they said, if I get approaching proficiency for every single thing, then all I will be able to get is, I think they said a 75 for the specific project it was. And so then I started thinking about it, and I talked to the student, and I talked to the whole class too. But I did say that, the rubric is a guide, and it has a variety of different criteria. So it's not like in each project, once you get an approaching proficiency here, that dictates your entire performance, and so everything becomes a 15. But it did kind of clue me into the students' way of thinking, and that is that, they want chances to succeed, and they don't want to be categorized in such a way that they automatically fail or automatically fall into a category that they don't want to be a part of. So I do want to make sure that in your execution of rubrics, as well as my own, that students have opportunities to show, some of their strengths so that it can make up for areas of their lack of strength or some of their deficiencies, and that it does become, a balance exercise, and that it's, that the student doesn't feel like they get penned into one category or another, that there's always the opportunity that within artifacts, maybe they knock this one out of the park and this is a 20, and then, that makes up for the fact that they're lacking proficiency in this first category. And that was another reason why I started using that well, it would be here a 5th column, but that additional column of an outstanding performance to show a student that it is possible also to go above and beyond this particular field and add extra points that might compensate for something else later. So another example of a rubric, this is more multi-purpose. This is a rubric that I borrowed and edited from another Latin teacher that I had found online many years ago. So if you are from Providence, Rhode Island, thank you. I forget the name of the teacher. It's here. I did cite the person here. Mr. Spencer from Providence High School. If you know him, or if you are him or her, please say thank you. So I have adapted it for my own needs over the last few years. I have this in both a 100-point rubric as well as a 50-point rubric. This is an example of when I have used the criteria in a much more narrow way to make sure that I'm accommodating for a wide variety of what I'm really looking for. So like grammatical accuracy for translation pertains to a lot of different fields. And so I broke it down into two things. There's nouns and adjectives, and then there's verbs. So that, you know, a student might know their noun cases really well, but maybe they're lacking with their verb tenses. And so I can kind of use this. Now, this is for holistic translation grading. This is so that I don't have to look at a translated piece of Latin and, check off the individual errors and, take off a half a point for each mistake or anything like that. So I did use this and adapt it for my own purposes, because grading a translation can be a very time-consuming effort. And so this allows me to look at a piece holistically and say, you know what, for the most part, all of their nouns and adjectives were in the correct case. Maybe I noticed one or two incidents where it wasn't, and then that enables me to just kind of go through a text quickly and just kind of make, at a cursory glance, say, okay, they're definitely advanced proficiency here. And then this, as I said, this kind of speaks to the idea of using the various criteria in separate ways to keep the students graded in a variety of different ways. And then, again, because I don't want to spend too much time here, this is a rubric for poetry discussion that I'm actually going to be looking at later for something else. But this is a rubric. The terms are a little bit different in terms of the proficiency level, but high quality, very good, competent, and developing. And I think that even the term developing, I think that that's even a more positive approach than poor or fair. And I think that kind of gives students a more positive spin on the idea that maybe their performance was not the highest quality, but that they're working on it, and that they're coming along in a variety of different ways. This is another example of a rubric that has a written description for each of the various categories, which I realize, they are hard to write, but sometimes you need them to differentiate for students, what it means to have a high quality knowledge of Latin text or a high quality frequency of contribution. When it comes to frequency of contribution, and I had a reference to this here in the recitation rubric, I just want to address the number concept. So like this one says 3 to 4 instances of error, 5 or more instances of error. It's really hard to quantify that. But students, a lot of students, at least at my high school, they're really, really almost like obsessed with data. And so they want to know, like, how many mistakes can I make without actually losing credit for anything, really. But in a rubric, they really want to know, like, can I mess up? Can I make like 1 or 2 mistakes and it'll still be okay? And so, but I think that kind of is antithetical to the idea of a rubric, right? Because with a rubric, you want to be able to have a little bit of leeway and a little bit of wiggle room to be able to kind of make a judgment call. So, I'm not saying that there's a right way or a wrong way to deal with it, but that's something to think about as you're developing your rubric. Do you want something that's quantifiable in terms of, the frequency of the discussion? Do you want to say contributes to the discussion 3 to 4 times, or do you think that frequently is enough to show a student what you want from them? And I think, you know your students, your population, and what works best for your students. I think that if I gave this discussion rubric to my students, I think they'd ask me, well, what do you mean by very frequently? And here it says more than 4 times, but I don't want them sitting there in a discussion that should be productive and analytic and just checking it off like, okay, I've done it 3 times, I've done it 4 times. Okay, good, I can just relax now. So, you can kind of play around with that as well. All right. So we've talked a little bit about the considerations for criteria. And again, I don't think I have the market cornered here, because I don't think that there's any right answer to the number of criteria that you should have. I think that if you have fewer criteria, you can have more focus. But if you have more focus, you can also expand or more criteria rather, you can expand the possibilities for students to be successful or to compensate for areas where they're not always going to be successful. And then initially, when we were talking about what not to do in a rubric, we were talking about using the criteria for requirements versus the content of the project. So I think having a healthy balance for that is a key. And then also we talked a little bit about considering the categories that you're doing, the categories of like where the grades are and what the numbers actually mean. So, consider subjectivity, consider objectivity. I know that in my school, at least, or in my district, there's an ongoing discussion about proficiency-based learning and standard-based learning. And I believe that there are a lot of districts and states really that are moving to standards-based assessment and standards-based learning. I would say if you have some really good state standards, or if you have the actual standards for the classical languages, I think that that might be a good starting point for you with your rubrics as well. In New Jersey, where I teach, we really have awful foreign language standards for Latin, at least. I mean, for the other languages, I'm sure that they're lovely, but for Latin, they really do not capture the stuff that we do in our classroom every day. So I would love for New Jersey to change and have more standards that are directed at classical languages, so that would also help me to form my rubrics too, because it's hitting state standards. So maybe you're lucky. Maybe you have lovely state standards that you can use for this as well. So with all these things in mind, one thing that I wanted to bring to attention is the idea of a performance checklist. So I had taken an assessment class as part of one of my master's programs a few years ago, and we were talking about rubrics, and we were talking about the criteria for success and the grading categories, and we were having this discussion among us in the class. And so we turned to the discussion to the idea of a performance checklist, and it kind of takes the idea of a rubric and it modifies it, but it keeps the idea of a rubric very much, I believe, alive. So I wanted to show you two different rubrics that I use that are actually not a traditional rubric, but they are what I call a performance checklist. So this is an example, and I gave you a screen cap on the actual document. I don't remember if I remembered to link. So if I didn't, please just flag me down, and I'm happy to link this document to the original presentation that you have access to. So this is what a performance checklist is, and it has that criterion here, and the ideal version of the criterion is expressed here. So I only had to write it out one time. That this is what I'm looking for in the project. So I'm not just saying virtual tour and then giving different text in each of these boxes for what the virtual tour could look like depending on the level of proficiency. I'm saying what I'm envisioning for a virtual tour is that my student is assuming the role of a tour guide, they're utilizing Google Maps, they're introducing monuments, they're giving us basic information, and they're using the 360 or the panoramic view. So I'm establishing now that that's the ideal version. And I'm telling the students here that a check version of this, like when you get credit for it, you get 20 points. And that's what I'm looking for. So when a student is giving their presentation, I can look at this and I can say, you know what, they're actually doing a really good job, or they're doing the virtual tour exactly as how I would have pictured it. You get 20 points for it. But in this performance checklist setting, I have two different fields here for check plus or check minus. So if the student is not delivering on an area of performance, I have the opportunity to type something in here as they're giving their presentation and say, wow, you did a really great job of all of these things. I really liked how you did a switch between 360 and panoramic. Whatever my feedback is, I can include it here, and then because it's a check plus, I can kind of give like 30 points to the student after all of my feedback. When I use this, I also try to note that if I were to put this in bold or a different color, that's the feedback I want to focus on, that student took that piece of the direction and really ran with it in a very positive direction. And then obviously I could do the same on the check minus side and say, I wish that you had done this, or, this was the area that was lacking, I can just kind of cut it and paste it over here and say, the tour lacked a 360 view. And then I can give it a score of, 15, or I could give it a score of 20, or, something like that. Now, you do have to be careful using a performance checklist in this way and assigning other numbers here, because this does take away from the more chart-based rubric where everything is quantified. And a student might look at this and think that your grading is capricious in some way, shape, or form because you gave them a check minus and you somehow reduced their score to a 0 for this area or something like that. So that's why I do try to balance my written feedback in this section with the score so that they know that it's not just a random number that I came up with, but it's because they miss this thing and that thing. So, I took away, 2/3 of the point because they missed 2/3 of the assignment. So the other performance checklist that I wanted to show you was another project that I did. And these are project specific performance checklists, but I hope that it still helps to kind of generate your ideas about it. I structured this rubric a little bit differently, or this performance checklist. Again, I did have, the idealized version of what I want over here. Here, I have started to emphasize some words in bold, kind of give the kids an idea of where they should be focusing on. And then I structured it a little bit differently here, but, here is where I would write, instead of 30 points, maybe they got 40 points for doing something. And then my feedback is, wow, you really ran with this project, and then I can give them that feedback right there. So that's how to do a performance checklist. And one other thing that I wanted to note real fast, and this is also on the presentation. So I've been using a performance checklist like this for a long time, and I've always had check plus and check minus as my, my other categories, if you will. I attended a really great keynote session at a professional development conference last month, and there's a guy by the name of Anthony Stray, and he's a really fantastic inspirational educator from Westchester County, and he provided a really great suggestion that I want to start using when I, start editing my performance checklist in the future. Instead of a check plus, he has a column called celebrations. And instead of check minus, he has a column called suggestions. And I think that that's a really powerful way to give your feedback in a way that is, again, still pretty positive and not saying you did this terribly because, or you did this really well because. I really loved the idea of celebrations too. So, all right, good. So,
Stephanie, can I ask you one quick question?
Yes.
How are these received by your students after you've done them over the, like a year? Do they find this a comfortable way to be graded? Do they feel guided by it?
My limited answer to that is that no one has ever complained about their grade.
No, that's a good answer. I think that's it.
Yeah, because I think that I've been as clear as possible by setting them up to use this, and then by giving them that very specific feedback. So I have not received any sort of I don't understand why I got that particular grade. I haven't really had any complaints. So I'm taking that as a positive sign. I mean, I guess you bring up a good point though. I stand to, interview my students more specifically to see how they like them. So maybe I'll do that next year. My professional development goal is to ask my students a little bit more about their experience.
Well, I think your measure is a valid one. I mean, some kids get really nitpicky, and then you're going nuts trying to defend the number. And some kids try to be nitpicky about what you described. Well, I did that, and you may not have thought they did that. So the fact that your kids aren't giving you any kind of feedback that's negative, both you're presenting it well, and they understand it, I think. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I do make sure that when I assign a project, they get the rubric on assignment day.
Yes, absolutely.
Right, so that they know what to expect and what's coming down the pike to them. But then also I can turn around and if they say, if you're looking at this one, says, they have to use Latin vocabulary in this project. And if they say, oh, I didn't know we had to. Well, my argument is, I think, a pretty valid one. Well, you knew, you had access to this. Whether or not you read it is a different story, I suppose.
Right. Well, that's valid.
Okay, so now we come to the how. So this is, okay, you've got a lot of ideas for rubrics. You want to create performance checklists. You want to use it. Maybe I've sparked something in you. So now we're going to talk about the how of how to use rubrics in the classroom from a technological standpoint. So I have 2 suggestions for you in the realm of Google Classroom. So the first one is a relatively, I don't want to say easy one, but it's a lot more approachable, and it's a good way of sort of substituting existing technology for something that you might have done already. So maybe you already have rubrics written and you already use them, but maybe you print them out now and you give them to all the students. My suggestion for you would be to develop your rubric as a Google Doc, not as a Microsoft Word document, because it won't transfer the same way. So it has to be a Google Doc in order to do what I'm about to instruct you to do. It's very possible that you all are sitting on your computers at home and you already have existing rubrics as Word documents. It is very viable and possible to upload your Word document to a Google document, but just double check your formatting first to make sure that, your I's are dotted, your T's are crossed, your columns are exactly the right width, et cetera, et cetera. So once you have your rubric established as a Word document, the easiest method of using a rubric on Classroom is to really just create an assignment. So I'm going to go ahead and create an assignment for my students. I would probably not actually pull the trigger and assign something because they're going to get an email and they're going to be like, what, we have a project? But when you go to create in Classroom, you're going to go to create an assignment. And then this is the area where you would say, Roman city project. You give them the instructions, and then you add the rubric that you want to use. I'm going to go to my recent documents, and here's the city project. And then the key here is that instead of students can view file, you want to make 1 copy of this document for each student. And then, with, I think, fairly typical project development, if you create the project itself, here's where you might also add the document that says, like, this is what you're supposed to do for the project. That can be a view only, and you can have this as make a copy for each student. So you can have 2 things in one assignment, and this one creates this for each student. The other one just has the 1 copy for the students to do. So then based on that, so if the project is going to be due, next month, you select the due date, the time is optional, the topic is projects, and then you can go ahead and assign it. And then on that day, when the students are giving their presentations, you will grade it as you would normally grade any assignment that you give on Classroom, where each student has a copy that he or she is submitting of the assignment. So that each student now has a document that says, Rome City Project hyphen, student A, Rome City Project hyphen student B. So it's personalized to the student. And then that also helps because the privacy is up there too, that you don't have to work on, sharing the document with each individual student at a time. To accomplish this for a group project, you can actually do it the exact same way. Make a copy for each student. And then when the students are presenting their projects, students 1 through 4 are presenting in a group, I just open the rubric for student 1 and I fill it out diligently as they're doing their project. I give them their feedback. And then that document in its origin format is obviously only shared between me and the student, but then I will share manually that project rubric with the other 3 students with view access. So it is possible to do this with a group project as well, and just have 1 copy of it. And then once you're done grading it, you'll just hit grade and return, which is something that I'll show you in just a moment. So the other option that you have, and you probably saw this happening in when I was just in my other screen. I'm going to go to this classroom. this is a classroom of my faculty members. These are some of my colleagues, so I can quote get away with shipping them an assignment right now, and no one's going to bat an eye about it. So the other option for you, and this is a new thing. I'm actually, you know what, I'm going to go back to the presentation first, give you a core thing. So Google Classroom now has a feature where you can create a rubric right within the assignment. There are 3 options for you in terms of creating a rubric that's assignment specific. The first one is create rubric, and I'm going to show you how to do that tonight. The other option is reuse rubric, and I want you to know that reuse rubric only pertains to a rubric that you have also used within the same Google Classroom. So just kind of be cautious about that. You can't transfer a rubric from your other Latin 4 classroom or whatever it is. The final option is import from Sheets. I will say this function is a little bit limited, but the wonderful Alice Keeler has created a template that you can use to create the rubric in Sheets, and then you create the assignment in Google Classroom, and then you can import that specific Sheets document. So if you are on this presentation, you can click where it says Alice Keeler template, and it'll take you to the spreadsheet template. It'll ask you to make a copy. You'll click make a copy, and you can do this, you know, now or later when you're ready to start this process. This is what the template looks like. You fill it in with your information about the standards, the description, the title, etc. You may want to give it a new title. You know, this is Roman Culture Project, whatever the case may be. And then when you go to create a rubric, which I'll show you in 1 second, you'll just select this sheet as the source data for completing a rubric on Classroom. But I'm going to show you how to create a rubric live, quote unquote, in Classroom right now. This is kind of a bare bones overview of what you're about to see. When you go to create an assignment, you're going to get a screen that looks just like this. And I'm going to show you how to manage each of the fields. So the criterion title, that's, you know, the description, the ideal version of what you want for each of the parts of the project. The description of the criterion, and then a points, level title, and description. So I've given you an example of each of these so that you can kind of figure out how your notion of a rubric fits into what Google Classroom is calling a rubric. You have to remember that, you know, Google has a really great platform of products for teachers, but sometimes their terminology might not jive with the terminology that you know because you've been in the classroom and you've been using rubrics for a little bit longer. But I mean, this is such a phenomenal feature of Classroom that, you know, I really applaud them for doing it. So we're going to go live, and I'm going to show you how to create a rubric. And I have a rubric that I'm going to be copying and pasting from just to make it a little bit easier for us tonight, or a little bit quicker at least. So I'm going to go to create, and I'm going to go do assignment, and I'm going to say poetry discussion. And maybe I have some instructions, you know, this is based on tonight. Now over here in this right-hand side, you can click rubric. This is where you get those options of creating it right now from scratch, reusing from the same classroom, or importing it from a sheet, and specifically it's the Alice Keeler sheet. So I'm going to go ahead and create rubric just so I can show you the process. I probably won't go through the whole rubric tonight in the interest of time, but I just kind of want to show you the process of how you might do it. And, you know, in the interest of your own time, it's okay to also just copy and paste from existing documents that you have. So the criterion title is analysis quality. So I'm just going to copy that real quick, and I'm going to paste it in here. And for the criterion description, you know, you can play around with this, but this really doesn't need to necessarily be described at great length. So, you know, you could just say something kind of, I'm just going to say something pithy right now, the quality of the analysis. You can change this obviously depending on your rubric needs. So the points, how many points do you want to make this particular field? in this case, I'm going to make 5 as the total because that's how I've kind of designed it. So I'm going to make it 5 points total. The level is high quality. I'm just copying and pasting. So, if you want to use terms like proficiency and stuff like that, absolutely go do that, because I think that, you're entitled to do as you wish. So now this is the description of what it means to get a high quality score in this particular rubric. And I just paste all that in. And now I want to be able to say a 4, right? So I'm going to click this little plus sign. I'm going to add a level. And so now in order to get 4 points, and the descriptor is very good. Sorry, I keep running into a tab issue here. I'm going to try to see if I can get away from the center of the screen a little bit here. Maybe that'll do. So the next one is called very good. So now I'm going to give it the title of very good, and then this is my description, and I can go on and on and on with all of my descriptions here to the right. I'll move on in 1 second. I'm just going to do that. Okay, so this is the first criterion, and the criterion is the quality of the analysis, right? So now I'm going to go down here and I'm going to add a new criterion. And the new criterion would be the next thing in category, knowledge of Latin text. And I can go, again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to do the entire rubric for you right now, but you'll go through the criteria one by one until you have, established everything. For right now, I'm actually going to back out of this. I'm going to discard changes. I'm going to discard this assignment because I'm actually going to show you a different assignment that I've already created a rubric for. So this assignment I created a couple nights ago in preparation for the webinar. I had 2 of my colleagues submit something to show you how to deal with a rubric, and it shows you within the assignment that there are 5 criteria and that the student can earn 25 points for this particular assignment. And then when you score the student, it'll actually go right into Google Classroom. As you know, Google Classroom doesn't always, launch directly to your student information system, but at least it gives you a nice round number for their performance. Okay, so I'm going to go to this assignment. I'm going to go to the students who have turned it in, and I'm going to go to this student's assignment first, since she is my friend and I can grade her. So before I grade her in this screen, I'm going to go back to the original slideshow because I just want to show you that this is all done in the presentation itself, just to kind of give you an idea of where the visuals are. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to grade Lauren's assignment. And to do that, I'm going to go over here to the right-hand side where it says grading. And I'm going to look at her submission here, and I can just kind of scroll and I can see what exactly she has submitted for the project. And over here in the place where the rubric is, I can hover over something and it'll show me what the category is. And she got advanced proficiency for her contribution. All I have to do is click it and the score comes up. Now, originally I had toggled it as a grade of a 100. You can obviously change the grade to be exactly the value of the rubric grade, or it'll automatically calculate it that the rubric itself is worth 25 points, so it multiplies everything by 4 for you. The quality of her work was proficient, her attitude was advanced proficient, her focus was a little bit below proficiency, and working well with others, she gets a 4 out of 5 for that. So now I can see that with all of the rubric grades that I've given her, her total grade is 20 out of 25. It naturally expands it to an 80 out of 100. And then I also have the option of adding a private comment from the rubric too. So, great job with your, overall performance, something like that. When I click post, it's going to send her a notification that her assignment has been graded, and it'll show her where on the rubric each of her scores fell. So I'm going to click post, and that's the grade. And I'm going to go up here for 1 second. I just have to move this screen. Now that her grade my comment has been posted, and her rubric has been graded, I can just return her assignment and it'll log her her rubric grade as well. Oh, look, it's giving me a rubric. Let's see here. Much better. Okay, sorry, I'm a survey geek. I didn't want to ignore the survey.
Me too.
So in group work, you can see here that there's one student who has already been graded and her grade is 80 out of 100. I can go to her entry, her submission here, and I can see her various rubric grades. And I think if I wanted to make changes, I probably could make a change now. Yes, see, I can make a change right now. It'll automatically recalculate it, and I can return it to her again. So, if she comes up to me and says, you know what, the work quality was not my best, but it was because, I was sick the week before or something like that, and maybe I want to adjust something. So you can adjust and make a live adjustment for that right in Classroom.
Just one quick question. Your students said, wait a minute, I can only get a certain, like an 80. One of the criticisms that I know was talked about at my school among teachers was that it was dramatic. Like if a kid it was really like an A was getting 100 and a B was getting, as you say, an 80. That was the second category, and we wouldn't grade that way. Have you ever seen any discussion on how far apart the categories end up making the grade?
We have had discussions about that as well. I've talked to my supervisor about it a couple times too, because you're absolutely right. You do have to have a balance of, how you're distributing the points. And I think that that's part of what is considered when you're thinking about how many criteria you want to have. The more you have, the more you have to spread those grades out. But it does kind of force you to prioritize where you're going to assign those grades and what's important to you in the scope of that project. Right.
And not ending up kind of punishing a kid who's a good student, but the way the grading goes, they find themselves someone who carries a 90 something all of a sudden having an 80 because that's the only category the math falls into.
Yes.
A B a B might have been an 88 normally. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I had a big issue about that, and we never really resolved it before I left. So I was curious what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if there's ever going to be just one answer to that, and I think it depends on what the project is and how each teacher constructs it. And actually, the last thing that I was going to show you partially addresses some of that too. So I'm going to get into that real quickly so I can show you. So the final solution I have for everybody about developing rubrics and getting them out to people actually does not involve Classroom. So if you're not a Google Classroom person, you can still do it in a spreadsheet fashion that doesn't involve Google Classroom. It will involve a Google spreadsheet though, so you do have to have a little bit of facility, or at least with understanding what a Google spreadsheet is or looks like. The marvelous Alice Keeler created this program called Rubric Tab that I've been using for a couple of years now, and it's really, really phenomenal. So I provided a link for you here, and you can go to it as well. I'll open it in a new tab for you. So this becomes what's called an add-on with a Google Sheet. So I'll explain what all this means in a second. If you were to click on it too, you're going to get to the same prompt, do you want to copy it? The correct answer is yes. You want to make a copy of it. You want to be able to use it. Now, I have screen capped in the presentation itself to kind of give you an idea of what it looks like. When you first get to it, you're given a field to put in your roster, so your list of students, and then all the students' email address. So, if you're a record keeper like me, and you probably have a list somewhere. So, student 1 and student 2. And then, I'm going to just put in a couple email addresses. Personal email address. I'm going to put in clctraining.org. So what you would do is really, you can copy and paste like anything you want into this template. It's really beautiful. It's so easy to use. So you copy, and I would only do this, by the way, sorry, I messed up with your email address. Anyway, I would only do this by class. I would not do this if you have 3 sections of your Latin 3 class. I would not do this for every one of them. I would try to separate it by class just to keep your own sanity about which class you're grading in each specific document. It's CLC training, Cambridge.org.
Right.
Okay, good. So there are a series of prompts within this template that will help you. Essentially, you're going to click on Edit this rubric, and this is what I've screen capped within the presentation. And this is, description of criteria 1, level 4, description of criteria 1 at level 3, just, and so on and so forth. And then it gives you the opportunity to enter the assignment name. So it's, Roman City Project. Now, this speaks to, as I was mentioning earlier, this speaks to, the conversation that Ginny and I were having about the weighting of respective grades. Because right now, if you look at it, advanced is 100, proficient is 85, basic is 75, in progress is 65. It's really, really hard to fail in this rubric.
Right.
And I know that, and I don't mean this in a disparaging way, but I've had really low performing kids who turn in low performing projects with this rubric and they don't fail. You really have to tank it, like not do it. You have to get zeros in all of these more than one category to really fail this rubric. And even, unacceptable in my book, that's like not doing it, versus in progress, which is you did it. It was just very, very poor in the way that you were doing it. So when you put in all of your descriptions and all of your categories, and when you name all this stuff, then you have, like a functioning document. It'll walk you through what to do. I'm just going to kind of give you a quick hint because I know we're pressed for time here. This is, as I said, an add-on. You've already added the add-on to Google Sheets, and you go up to this add-on menu, you click Rubric tab, and then you click Start. It's so weird. I just authorized it a few hours ago. I guess it's because I'm using it on a different computer. Go figure. Okay, so I'm going to allow it to do what it needs to do. Again, here is this wonderful dialog box. It walks you through everything that you're supposed to do. And then once you create rubrics, once you click this Create Rubric button, it's going to create a new tab on the bottom of this spreadsheet for each student. I'm going to just go ahead and create rubrics right now so that you can see exactly what it does. It takes a second. But then student 1 has his own rubric, student 2 has her own rubric, and it's, automatically labeled with their number. So now when student 1 gives, or student 2 gives their presentation, I can say, okay, the student got a 3 in this category, a 4 in that category, a 2 here, and a 1 here. So, I mean, look, I'm giving pretty low grades. The student ended up with a B- for the project overall. Now I have the opportunity to log any, specific comments to the kid. But the beauty of this is that after you put in the roster with each of their email addresses, I can click this one little button, Email Rubrics, and it is going to send an email with a spreadsheet and a PDF of every single student's rubric to him or her individually. And it's going to create a copy of that rubric in my Google Drive. I know I'm over time, so I'm trying to move really quickly just to end it. I've linked a copy of a document. I have not named the student to keep their privacy. This is what a finalized project looks like from a student. So this is, I've even customized the font to something that was more palatable to me than Arial. Not that I have anything against Arial, but then you can also see here I have customized feedback for that particular student. Good work here. The grammar questions were not consistently. So, there is still the idea of that performance checklist of giving, constructive feedback that speaks to the various areas on the rubric itself. This is another student sample. You're probably going to see more of the same thing where the student, scored here. And then this is all of my comments kind of, in one field. So this rubric tab thing, It is super easy to use. I really like using it. It helps to kind of get the information out as quickly as possible. One of the cons of this, and as I said, it automatically generates a Google Sheet and a PDF of every student's grading rubric automatically in your drive. So just be prepared to do a little bit of cleanup as soon as you get the students their rubrics. And then, as I said, in my discussion with Ginny, like the grading becomes pleasant because, again, it is very, very hard to fail using this particular model. So keep that in mind. I mean, not that we want to fail students. We want students to succeed. I realize that. But you do want to make sure that your categories are weighted in, an accurate way to reflect a student's performance. If you notice in the student sample, I actually changed the categories. The original template has 4 25% categories. I changed it for this assignment to 5 20% categories. And I still didn't have any kids who failed this particular assignment.
And it seems to me that the thing that would answer my own question was if a student has an 85 and feels that's kind of, not reflective of who they really are, then the argument is, well, at least in 1 or 2 categories, you really have to try to get an advanced.
Yes.
Or same with the basic. If I don't usually get 75s, I usually get 80s. Well, maybe you need to dial it up a little bit.
Right. At least in one of the areas to kind of carry over that score.
Yeah, you could, if you got advanced in something, it would just clean it up,
Yeah. So that's all I have. I'm sorry I had to kind of go fast at the end, but I hope that this was a helpful discussion for everybody about rubrics. I hope that I got some wheels turning in your head about, how your rubrics look right now, and, ways that you are already very much succeeding in writing your rubrics. And I hope that I've at least also given you some tech tools to use to distribute those rubrics in a more efficient way, and in a less papery way. So thank you so much for your time tonight. These are the email addresses of both Ginny and Martha and Donna and myself so that you can contact us at any time.
Well, actually, it's just Ginny and Martha. Donna has retired.
Oh, she has.
Since she's having a good old time being a person who doesn't have a schedule or much of a schedule.
Okay.
We thank you so very much for doing this. We always love hearing your thoughts, and you're so comfortable around the whole tech world, that I really appreciate that because I love it. But it's just, I think, helps people to feel more comfortable, and especially around the Google program.
Thank you.
We're hoping that you'll come back again. And if anybody has any questions, as Stefanie said, please use one of these 2. And of course, with ours, if you have any problems, questions, thoughts, and especially ideas for webinars, we would love to hear from you. Thank you so much, and good night.